A heavy fog clung to the early morning air as Alara stood at the gates of the mansion, her breath rising in soft clouds around her face. It was a morning like any other, and yet everything felt different, an unease that crept into her chest, but she shrugged it off as nerves. After all, it was her first day working for the enigmatic billionaire. The offer had come suddenly, as if from nowhere, and the salary was almost too good to believe. It promised to change her life, lift her out of the endless routine of double shifts, small paychecks, and nights spent counting the little money she had. All she had to do was take care of an elderly woman in a massive, isolated mansion. The gate opened with a low, creaking sound, and she stepped inside, adjusting the strap of her simple leather bag. Her life as a nurse had taught her patience, had molded her into someone who could handle stress with a calm demeanor. But as she walked up the long stone pathway toward the mansion, she could feel the weight of the place pressing down on her. The mansion loomed above her like something out of a painting. It was an architectural marvel, a towering structure with vast wings, countless windows, and ivy clinging to its stone walls. Its grandeur, though beautiful, felt foreboding. A chill crept down her spine, but Alara forced a smile as the door opened before she had a chance to knock. Standing at the entrance was a man in his early 50s, dressed impeccably in a dark suit. His features were sharp, his expression unreadable as his eyes scanned her from head to toe. "Miss Alara?" His voice was calm but carried an authority that made her stand a little straighter. "Welcome. I am Mr. Kingsley, the butler. The staff and I will be at your service should you need anything." "Thank you," Alara managed, feeling small under his gaze. Without further words, Mr. Kingsley stepped aside and gestured for her to enter. Inside, the mansion was even more overwhelming. The ceiling seemed impossibly high, and the walls were adorned with artwork that looked ancient and priceless. Chandeliers hung like frozen constellations, their crystals sparkling in the dim morning light. The floor beneath her feet was a mosaic of intricate marble patterns, and the air smelled faintly of polished wood and lavender. As she walked deeper into the house, the weight of the silence pressed in. Aside from her soft footsteps and the occasional rustle of Mr. Kingsley's suit, there was no sound, no hint of life despite the mansion's grandeur. It felt as though the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. "You'll be responsible for Mrs. Ansell," Mr. Kingsley said as they ascended a grand staircase. His tone was professional but distant, as if he had repeated these words many times before. "She is the mother of Mr. Leclerc, the owner of the house. Your duties are straightforward: ensure her comfort, administer her medications, and be attentive to her needs. She is in delicate health." Alara nodded, though her mind was racing. She had heard rumors of Mr. Leclerc, the reclusive billionaire with a fortune so vast that it had become the stuff of legend. But no one seemed to know much about him, only that he had made his money in ways no one fully understood. His mother, Mrs. Ansell, had been living in seclusion for years, or so the rumors said. Some claimed she had been ill for decades, while others whispered darker tales. They reached a corridor lined with heavy wooden doors, each one identical except for a small brass number etched near the handle. Mr. Kingsley stopped in front of one marked 12 and turned the handle, pushing the door open with a soft creak. Inside, the room was warm and inviting, with large windows that let in the soft glow of the morning sun. A fireplace crackled quietly in the corner, casting flickering shadows across the walls. The bed was enormous, covered in soft quilts and pillows, and lying in the center of it was Mrs. Ansell. Alara had expected a frail, withered woman, but Mrs. Ansell was still strikingly beautiful for her age. Her hair, though gray, was thick and pinned neatly in place. Her eyes were sharp, intelligent, though clouded by years of pain and illness. She looked at Alara with a mixture of curiosity and weariness. "Good morning, Mrs. Ansell," Mr. Kingsley said in a voice that was almost gentle. "This is Alara, your new nurse. She will be taking care of you from now on." Mrs. Ansell's gaze flicked to Alara, and for a moment, the two women simply looked at each other. Then Mrs. Ansell gave a small nod, her lips curving into a faint smile. "You have kind eyes," she murmured, her voice soft but clear. "I think we'll get along just fine." Alara smiled, her earlier nervousness fading slightly. "Thank you, Mrs. Ansell. I'll do my best to take care of you." With that, Mr. Kingsley excused himself, leaving Elara alone with Mrs. Ansell. The room was quiet again, save for the soft crackling of the fire. Elara busied herself with checking the medications laid out on the bedside table, making mental notes of what she would need to do throughout the day. Mrs. Ansell watched her silently, her eyes following every movement. "You must be wondering about this place," Mrs. Ansell said after a long stretch of silence. Elara glanced up, caught off guard by the sudden question. "It's certainly impressive," she said carefully, not wanting to offend Mrs. Ansell chuckled softly, though the sound was tinged with sadness. "Impressive, yes. But also empty. You'll see. This house has its secrets, just like the people in it." Elara didn't know how to respond to that, so she simply smiled and nodded, returning to her tasks. She had no intention of prying into the affairs of the mansion or its inhabitants. She was here to work, nothing more. The first day passed in a blur of routine tasks: medication administration, helping Mrs. Ansell with her meals, and ensuring she was comfortable. Despite the vastness of the mansion, Elara saw few other people. Occasionally, a maid would pass by, silent and efficient, or Mr. Kingsley would appear to ask if she needed anything, but for the most part, Elara felt isolated in the grand, empty house. As night fell, she settled into the small room that had been assigned to her, grateful for the quiet. Her room, though modest compared to the rest of the mansion, was comfortable. The bed was soft, and the windows overlooked the sprawling gardens below, which were now cloaked in shadow. She could hear the distant hum of the wind outside, but inside, the mansion was as still as ever. Sleep came easily, but her dreams were restless, filled with strange, disjointed images of endless corridors, locked doors, and the distant sound of voices she couldn't quite make out. The following days passed in much the same way, and Elara quickly fell into a routine. She cared for Mrs. Ansell, who, despite her initial frailty, proved to be a sharp-witted woman with a biting sense of humor. There was a warmth between them that Elara hadn't expected, and slowly, she found herself growing fond of the elderly woman. But there was an underlying tension in the mansion that Elara couldn't shake. It was as though the very walls held secrets, whispers of things long past. She began to notice small oddities, rooms that seemed perpetually locked, staff members who avoided eye contact, and the fact that she had yet to meet Mr. Leclerc himself. He remained an enigmatic figure, mentioned only in passing by Mrs. Ansell or Mr. Kingsley, but never seen. Late one evening, after tucking Mrs. Ansell into bed, Elara found herself wandering the halls. The mansion was quiet, as it always was, but tonight the silence felt heavier, more oppressive. She passed by a row of portraits, each one depicting a stern-looking man or woman dressed in the formal attire of a bygone era. The eyes of the portraits seemed to follow her as she walked, and a shiver ran down her spine. At the end of the hall, she noticed a door that she hadn't seen before. It was slightly ajar, a sliver of dim light spilling out from the crack. Curiosity tugged at her, and before she could stop herself, she reached out and pushed the door open. The nurse had settled into her routine at the mansion, but with every passing day, the mysteries within its walls seemed to grow deeper. Her charge, Mrs. Ansell, had become a presence that both grounded and mystified her. But the more Elara learned, the more she realized that this place, this family, was filled with secrets. Even though she was here to care for Mrs. Ansell, Elara couldn't ignore the subtle tension that seemed to pulse through the air, like an unsolved puzzle. Days turned into weeks, and Elara had begun to learn the intricacies of Mrs. Ansell's care regimen. Every morning, she would bring her tea, and they would sit by the window of Mrs. Ansell's large bedroom, watching the fog roll across the estate's vast gardens. It had become something of a ritual, an intimate exchange of stories and half-smiles, while the world outside the mansion remained an afterthought. But there was always something lingering at the edge of Elara's mind, the door she had discovered that night, the one that had been slightly ajar at the end of the long hallway. It had been weeks since she'd seen it, and she hadn't dared to return, but it haunted her thoughts. There was something about the door, about the light that had seeped from the crack, that beckoned her. For now, she kept her focus on her duties. Mrs. Ansell's health had been relatively stable since she started working there, though the old woman had moments of fragility that required all of Ilara's attention. One morning, as Ilara was preparing her medications, Mrs. Ansell's soft voice broke the silence. "You've been wondering about the locked rooms, haven't you?" Mrs. Ansell said, her tone sharp despite her frailty. Ilara froze, her hand hovering over the medication tray. She hadn't mentioned anything about the door or the locked rooms to anyone. How could Mrs. Ansell possibly know? What do you mean?" Ilara asked carefully, forcing herself to appear calm. A faint smile tugged at the corners of Mrs. Ansell's lips. "This house, my dear. It's full of things people try to forget. But nothing stays hidden forever." Ilara felt a shiver run through her. "I'm not here to pry into the family's affairs, Mrs. Ansell. I'm just here to take care of you." Mrs. Ansell gave a soft, almost dismissive laugh. "I've lived long enough to know that curiosity always finds a way, even when one tries to resist it." Ilara didn't respond. She finished preparing the medication and handed it to Mrs. Ansell, who took it with a steady hand. Despite her age, Mrs. Ansell's eyes were sharp, as if she could see straight through Ilara's thoughts. After that conversation, the air between them changed. Mrs. Ansell no longer spoke of the mansion's secrets, but Ilara couldn't shake the feeling that the older woman was waiting for Ilara to uncover something. And in truth, she was finding it harder to resist the pull of the house's hidden history. The mansion itself was a labyrinth. Ilara had explored the parts of it that were necessary for her duties, but there were entire wings she had never ventured into, places that were off-limits or simply forgotten. Late at night, when the silence of the house became almost unbearable, she would think about those locked rooms, about the things people tried to forget. One night, after Mrs. Ansell had fallen asleep, Ilara found herself wandering through the mansion's halls once more. The air felt different tonight, thicker, heavier, as though the house itself was alive, breathing around her. She passed through the familiar corridors, past the grand staircase, and eventually found herself back in that long hallway where she had seen the door ajar. The door was closed now, but as she stood before it, a strange sensation washed over her, a mix of dread and anticipation. She knew she shouldn't open it, knew it wasn't her place. And yet her hand moved to the handle of its own accord. Before she could talk herself out of it, she twisted the knob and pushed the door open. The room beyond was dark, save for the faint glow of moonlight streaming through a large window. It wasn't a grand room like the others in the mansion. This one felt more intimate, more personal. The walls were lined with bookshelves, filled with leather-bound volumes that looked ancient and worn. In the center of the room stood a large oak desk, cluttered with papers and what looked like old photographs. Ilara hesitated at the threshold, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew she should turn back, close the door and forget she had ever seen this place. But something drew her in, something stronger than her sense of caution. She stepped inside, the floor creaking softly beneath her feet. The room smelled of dust and old paper, the scent of time forgotten. As she approached the desk, she noticed a single photo lying atop a stack of papers. It was black and white, faded with age, but the faces were clear enough. Her breath caught in her throat as she stared at the photo. It was Mrs. Ansell, much younger, standing beside a man Ilara didn't recognize. But that wasn't what had her frozen in place. It was the third figure in the photo. A woman, smiling gently, her arm linked with Mrs. Ansell's. Ilara's mother. She blinked, sure she was imagining things. But no, the face in the photo was unmistakable. It was her mother, looking just as she had in the few photos Ilara had from her childhood. How was this possible? Her mother had died years ago, long before Ilara had ever come to this mansion. There was no reason she should be in a photograph with Mrs. Ansell. The room seemed to close in around her, the weight of the discovery pressing down on her chest. She staggered back from the desk, the photo still clutched in her trembling hand. Questions flooded her mind, but there were no answers, only confusion and a growing sense of unease. How had her mother known Mrs. Ansell? What was the connection between them? And why had no one ever told her about it? She stumbled out of the room, her mind racing. She needed answers, but there was no one to ask. She couldn't go to Mrs. Ansell, not yet. Not until she understood more. For the next few days, Alara moved through her duties in a daze. She went through the motions, caring for Mrs. Ansell, administering her medications, but her mind was elsewhere, consumed by the questions swirling inside her. Every time she looked at Mrs. Ansell, she wondered how much the older woman knew, if she was keeping secrets too. And then there was the photo, still hidden in the bottom of her bag, a constant reminder of the mystery she had uncovered. She found herself staring at it late at night, trying to make sense of it, but no answers came. It wasn't long before Mrs. Ansell noticed Alara's distraction. One afternoon, as Alara was helping her sit up in bed, Mrs. Ansell's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than usual. "You've found something, haven't you?" Mrs. Ansell asked, her voice soft but sharp. Alara's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't mentioned the photo to anyone, and yet Mrs. Ansell seemed to know. "I don't know what you mean," Alara said, trying to keep her voice steady. Mrs. Ansell's eyes narrowed slightly, but she didn't press the issue. Instead, she gave a small, knowing smile. "You'll find the truth, eventually," she said. "This house has a way of revealing things, whether we want it to or not." Alara didn't know how to respond to that. She finished her tasks in silence, her mind racing. Mrs. Ansell's words only deepened the mystery, but they also confirmed something Alara had already suspected. There were things in this house that she wasn't meant to know, things that had been hidden for a reason. But now that she had glimpsed the truth, she couldn't turn back. The photo of her mother had opened a door in her mind, and she needed to know what lay on the other side. That night, Alara returned to the room with the oak desk. She had been avoiding it since discovering the photo, but now, she felt compelled to go back, as if the answers she sought were waiting for her there. The room was just as she had left it, the papers still scattered across the desk, the books still lining the shelves. She moved to the desk, her fingers trembling as she sifted through the papers, searching for anything that might explain the connection between her mother and Mrs. Ansell. There were letters, old and yellowed with age, but they were written in a language Alara didn't understand. She set them aside, her frustration growing. There had to be something here, some clue that would lead her to the truth. As she searched, she felt a strange sense of urgency, as though time itself was slipping away. The mansion felt different tonight, quieter, darker, as if it, too, was keeping secrets. The discovery of her mother's photo within the mansion had shaken Alara to her core. The questions it raised were too overwhelming, too consuming. Every time she looked at Mrs. Ansell, she felt a growing unease, as if the woman held secrets so tangled with her past that confronting them could shatter everything she believed about her life. Alara felt like she was slowly unraveling the threads of her existence, piece by piece. It was impossible to ignore the nagging thought that the truth was lurking somewhere in the depths of the mansion. There was more to be discovered, more connections, more forgotten histories, and she felt a pull, a compulsion, to uncover them all. But her fear was just as strong, and it gnawed at her relentlessly. What if she wasn't ready for the answers? What if the truth she sought was far darker than anything she could imagine? Despite the questions tormenting her, Alara couldn't bring herself to confront Mrs. Ansell directly. How could she explain what she had found? How could she ask about her mother's connection to this place without seeming intrusive, without stirring up old wounds? Mrs. Ansell's health was fragile, and Alara didn't want to risk upsetting her. But the truth was festering beneath the surface, and it wouldn't remain hidden forever. Days passed in a blur. Alara carried out her duties with practiced efficiency, but her mind was constantly elsewhere, trapped in the labyrinth of secrets she had stumbled upon. Mrs. Ansell, for her part, seemed to notice Alara's distraction, though she never mentioned it again. There were moments, however, when their eyes would meet, and Alara could sense that Mrs. Ansell was waiting for Alara to ask the question she didn't yet have the courage to voice. One evening, Alara found herself once again drawn to the room where she had discovered the photograph. It had become almost a ritual for her, sneaking away late at night, when the mansion was quiet and the air was thick with the weight of its hidden past. The room had become a refuge of sorts, a place where Alara could sift through the fragments of history in an attempt to piece together the truth. As she entered the room, The familiar smell of dust and old paper greeted her, and she moved toward the desk where the photograph had first caught her attention. The photo still haunted her, but it was no longer enough to satisfy her curiosity. She needed more evidence, more clues. Elara began rummaging through the drawers of the desk, her movements quick and deliberate. Most of the papers were old correspondence, letters written in a delicate hand that she didn't recognize. They were addressed to various people whose names meant nothing to her, but the tone of the letters suggested a long history of secrecy. Elara carefully unfolded one of the letters, the paper yellowed with age. The letter was brief, written in a formal style, but one sentence stood out to Elara, asterisk. What was done must never come to light. Asterisk, her heart pounded in her chest. The letter was unsigned, and there was no indication of who had written it or to whom it had been sent, but the implication was clear. There was something in the Ansel family's past that had been deliberately buried, something so damaging that it couldn't withstand the light of day. As Elara placed the letter aside, she felt her pulse quicken. She knew she was on the verge of uncovering something significant, something that could explain the strange connection between her mother and this mansion. But just as she was about to continue her search, she heard a soft creak from behind her. Elara froze, her breath catching in her throat. She turned slowly, half expecting to find Mrs. Ansel standing in the doorway, her eyes filled with reproach. But when she looked, the hallway was empty. The only sound was the faint rustling of the curtains as a breeze passed through the open window. She let out a breath, her hands trembling slightly. Perhaps it was just the wind. But the feeling of being watched lingered, an uncomfortable sensation that sent shivers down her spine. She glanced around the room, her eyes sweeping over the shelves and the scattered papers. Everything was just as she had left it. And yet something felt different, as if the very atmosphere of the room had shifted. Elara shook her head, trying to clear her mind. She couldn't afford to let her imagination get the better of her. She was here to find answers, and she wouldn't leave until she had something more concrete to work with. Her search led her to a small, locked drawer in the desk. The lock was old and rusted, but it didn't take much effort for Elara to pry it open with the tip of a letter opener she found nearby. Inside the drawer, she found a bundle of letters tied together with a piece of frayed ribbon. The letters were addressed to someone named Eleanor, a name that didn't mean anything to Elara, but the handwriting was familiar. With trembling fingers, she untied the ribbon and unfolded the first letter. As she read, her heart sank. The letters were written by her mother. Each one was dated decades ago, long before Elara had been born. The letters spoke of things Elara had never known about her mother, travels to distant places, friendships with people Elara had never heard of, and a deep connection to the Ansel family. The tone of the letters was warm, affectionate even, but there was an undercurrent of secrecy that made Elara uneasy. One letter, in particular, stood out. It was dated shortly before Elara's birth and was written with a sense of urgency that set it apart from the others. Asterisk. Eleanor. Asterisk, it began. Asterisk. I fear that things have become far more complicated than we anticipated. I've tried to keep my distance, to protect you and the others, but I can no longer ignore what is happening. There are forces at play that I never fully understood, and I worry that my involvement has put us all in danger. Please, if you ever find this letter, know that I did what I thought was right, even if it cost me everything. Asterisk. Elara's hands shook as she read the words. Her mother had been involved in something far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. The letters didn't provide any specifics, but the tone was clear. There had been risks, threats that her mother had been trying to protect her from. But what could they have been? And how were they connected to Mrs. Ansel and the mansion? As Elara continued to sift through the letters, a picture began to emerge, a picture of her mother as someone far more complex, far more enigmatic, than the woman she had known. There had been secrets in her mother's past, secrets that had somehow led her to this mansion. But the full scope of those secrets remained just out of reach. The last letter in the bundle was different from the others. It wasn't addressed to Eleanor, but to Mrs. Ansel herself. Elara's breath caught as she read the opening lines. Asterisk. Dear Constance. Asterisk, it began. Asterisk. I know we haven't spoken in years, and I doubt you will ever forgive me for the choices I made. But there is something you must know, something that I have kept from you for far too long. I cannot explain everything in this letter, but I need you to understand that my reasons were not what you think. I never meant to betray you. I never meant to hurt you. But there is a truth I can no longer keep hidden, and it is one that will affect us all. The letter ended abruptly, as if her mother had been interrupted before she could finish. There were no further details, no explanation of what that truth might be. Alara's mind raced as she tried to make sense of it all. What truth had her mother been referring to? And why had she kept it hidden from Mrs. Ansell for so many years? She sat back in the chair, her thoughts spinning. The answers were tantalizingly close, but they remained just beyond her grasp. There were too many pieces missing, too many questions left unanswered. But one thing was clear. Her mother's connection to the Ansell family ran deeper than she had ever imagined, and the truth, whatever it was, had the power to unravel everything. As Alara sat there, staring at the unfinished letter, she realized that she couldn't leave things as they were. She needed to know the full story, no matter how painful or dangerous it might be. There was only one person who could provide the answers she sought, and that was Mrs. Ansell herself. The next morning, Alara approached Mrs. Ansell with a determination she hadn't felt before. She couldn't keep dancing around the truth any longer. The photograph, the letters, the cryptic conversations, it all pointed to something far bigger than Alara had realized. And now, she needed to confront it head-on. But as she entered Mrs. Ansell's room, she found the older woman sitting by the window, her gaze distant. There was something different about her today, something more vulnerable. Alara hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to begin. "Mrs. Ansell," she said softly, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside her. "I need to ask you something. About my mother." Mrs. Ansell didn't turn to look at her. For a long moment, there was only silence, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. Finally, Mrs. Ansell spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I knew this day would come, Alara. I've been waiting for it." Alara stood frozen, the weight of Mrs. Ansell's words pressing heavily on her. The truth that had been bubbling just beneath the surface was finally beginning to break through. She had spent days, weeks, navigating the hidden corridors of her mother's past, and now, it felt as though everything she had uncovered was leading to this moment, this confrontation. Mrs. Ansell's frail figure seemed to shrink even more in the soft light of the morning. She sat by the window, staring out at the sprawling grounds of the mansion as though they held the answers Alara sought. The older woman's hands trembled slightly, a telltale sign of the deep emotion stirring within her. "You knew my mother," Alara began, her voice quiet but firm. "You knew her in ways I never did. And I think you've been keeping something from me." Mrs. Ansell finally turned to look at Alara, her eyes clouded with something that resembled both regret and sorrow. She said nothing for a long moment, only studying Alara with an intensity that made the younger woman shift uneasily on her feet. Then, with a deep breath, Mrs. Ansell nodded, as if coming to terms with a decision she had been dreading for years. "You're right," she said at last, her voice hoarse and heavy with the weight of old memories. "There's something you need to know. Something that should have been told to you a long time ago, but She faltered, her hand reaching up to press against her chest as if the truth was physically painful to release. "I thought it was better left buried." Alara felt her heart pounding in her chest. This was it, the moment of revelation. The truth that had eluded her was finally within reach, but fear twisted inside her. Would she be ready to handle what was coming? Could anything prepare her for what Mrs. Ansell was about to say? Taking a step closer, Alara knelt beside Mrs. Ansell, gently reaching out to take her hand. The older woman's fingers were cold, fragile, and for a moment, Alara wondered just how much this truth had cost Mrs. Ansell over the years. "What is it?" Alara asked, her voice soft but insistent. "Please, I need to know." Mrs. Ansell exhaled slowly, her grip tightening around Alara's hand. She glanced down at their intertwined fingers, her lips trembling as she began to speak. "Your mother," Mrs. Ansell started, her voice breaking on the words. She wasn't just my friend, Elara. She was my daughter. Elara's mind went blank, the shock of the revelation hitting her like a physical blow. She stared at Mrs. Ansell, her heart racing, her thoughts scrambling to make sense of the words that had just been spoken. Daughter? No, that couldn't be right. Her mother, her real mother, had raised her, had loved her, had been everything to her. How could this be true? No, Elara whispered, shaking her head. That's not possible. You can't be serious. I am, Mrs. Ansell replied, her voice laced with sorrow. I wish I wasn't, but I am. Elara pulled her hand away, rising to her feet as the room seemed to close in around her. Her mother, her real mother, had never mentioned anything like this. There had never been any hint, any clue that she was connected to this place, to this woman, in such a way. How could her mother have hidden something so monumental? Why? Elara asked, her voice sharp with disbelief and confusion. Why would she hide this from me? Why would she keep something like this a secret? Mrs. Ansell turned back toward the window, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of the years was finally bearing down on her. She thought she was protecting you, she murmured. She thought that by keeping you away from this place, from me, she was giving you a better chance at life. She didn't want you to be caught up in the same mess that destroyed everything between us. Elara's mind whirled, trying to piece together the fragments of the past that Mrs. Ansell had revealed. Her mother had been the daughter of this wealthy, powerful family? But that didn't make sense. Elara had grown up in near poverty, struggling alongside her mother in ways that no daughter of a billionaire family should have. It didn't add up. But we were poor, Elara said, her voice tinged with confusion. We barely had enough to get by. If she was your daughter, why didn't she ever? Because she left it all behind. Mrs. Ansell interrupted, her voice thick with emotion. She chose to walk away from this life, from the wealth and the power. She couldn't bear the cost of staying. There were things happening here that she couldn't accept. Secrets, lies, betrayals. Mrs. Ansell's voice cracked, and she pressed her fingers to her lips to stifle a sob. She was my only child, but I drove her away. Elara stood there, speechless, the enormity of what Mrs. Ansell was saying crashing over her. Her mother had walked away from this life, from wealth, security, everything, because of something dark that had been festering within the walls of this mansion. Something so terrible that it had driven her to sever ties with her own family. What happened? Elara asked quietly. What was it that made her leave? Mrs. Ansell wiped a tear from her cheek, her expression distant as if she were seeing events from long ago unfold before her eyes. There was a scandal, she said, her voice trembling. A scandal that nearly destroyed our family. Your mother, Eleanor, she found out things that she was never supposed to know. Things about the family's business dealings, about how we maintained our wealth. There were illegal activities, dangerous people involved. When she found out, she couldn't live with it. She couldn't stay. Elara felt a cold chill run through her. The Ansell family had been involved in criminal activities? That was the last thing she had expected to hear. Her mother had always been a woman of strong moral principles, a woman who stood up for what was right, no matter the cost. It made sense now, why she would leave, why she would abandon everything she had ever known. And you? Elara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. What did you do? Mrs. Ansell closed her eyes, her face crumpling with guilt and regret. I let her go, she said softly. I didn't stop her. I should have, but I didn't. I was too proud, too angry. I thought she would come back eventually, but she never did. By the time I realized how wrong I had been, it was too late. She had built a new life, away from me, away from all of this. Elara's heart ached for the pain in Mrs. Ansell's voice. Despite everything, despite the secrets and the lies, it was clear that Mrs. Ansell had loved her mother deeply. But love hadn't been enough to bridge the chasm between them. And my father? Elara asked, the question slipping out before she could stop herself. She had never known who her father was. Her mother had never spoken of him. Mrs. Ansell hesitated, her eyes flicking toward Alara with a mixture of sorrow and apprehension. He was involved, she said slowly, choosing her words carefully. He was one of the people your mother was trying to escape from. Alara's stomach dropped, a sick feeling of dread spreading through her. What do you mean? Mrs. Ansell pressed her hands together, her knuckles white. Your father was one of the men involved in the illegal dealings. He wasn't a good man, Alara. He wasn't someone your mother could trust. When she found out about his involvement, she left him. She didn't want you to grow up around that kind of influence. Alara felt a wave of nausea wash over her. The idea that her father had been part of something so dark, so corrupt, it was almost too much to bear. She had always wondered about him, had always hoped that one day she would learn the truth. But this was not the truth she had wanted. I'm sorry, Mrs. Ansell said quietly, her voice filled with remorse. I know this is a lot to take in, but I thought you deserved to know the truth. Your mother, she did what she thought was best for you. She wanted to protect you, even if it meant cutting you off from this family, from this life. Alara stood there in silence, her mind racing, her emotions swirling in a chaotic storm. The truth had finally been laid bare, but it felt like a jagged wound, raw and painful. Her mother had sacrificed everything to protect her from the darkness of the Ansell family, from the man who had fathered her. And now, that darkness had come back to haunt her in ways she could never have imagined. Mrs. Ansell turned her gaze back toward the window, her voice a soft whisper as she spoke the final words that would forever change Alara's understanding of her past. I never stopped loving her, Mrs. Ansell said, her eyes distant and filled with sorrow. And I never stopped loving you, even though I didn't know you. I just hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me. Alara's chest tightened with emotion, tears stinging her eyes as the weight of everything settled over her. The truth had been painful, but in that pain, there was also a strange sense of closure. The pieces of her past, the mysteries that had haunted her, had finally come together. She took a deep breath, her heart heavy with the knowledge of the choices her mother had made, and the life she had sacrificed to give Alara a chance at something better. It was a burden she would carry with her, but it was also a testament to her mother's love, a love that had transcended the darkness of their shared history. And in that moment, as the sun began to rise over the mansion, casting its warm light over the grounds, Alara knew that her journey was far from over. But for the first time in her life, she felt as though she understood who she was, and where she came from. The end.